Hey guys, what's up? I really enjoyed reading everything that you guys put on the Padlet. And one of the biggest takeaways that I got from everything that you guys wrote was that you take this task of voting very seriously. And that's a great thing to see. And also your struggle with this question of what does it mean to be qualified to vote? Who should be allowed to vote? And that's a question that we've been asking ourselves since the beginning of the creation of our republic. And I think it's such a good thing for us to think about. Really, it's hopefully one of the most important lessons that I can teach you in government is what does it mean to be a voter? And when we vote, what power does that bring us? And what are the limitations when it comes to voting? And so that's something that is the first question that I want us to address as we move forward. The second thing that I think is a really interesting question is, has the right to vote been an inalienable right? In other words, since the founding of our republic, how have we evolved in terms of who gets to vote? And that's a really interesting long journey that we've been on in our republic. And notice up here, you guys, I'm emphasizing this word republic. And that's really important for us to remember. We're not a direct democracy. And sometimes I think when we're thinking about voting and this sacred idea of voting in a democracy, we think to ourselves about direct democracy, that in fact we're making really critical, important decisions about the law itself and the rule of law and how laws are going to get enforced when we vote. But that's not really what we're doing. All we're doing is we're just assigning people to this task of creating laws or enforcing laws or interpreting laws. And so, there were a lot of things that you guys thought about. And that's what I listed up here in terms of, these five things were big ideas that came out a lot when you guys were writing on your Padlet. First of all, everyone wanted to address this issue of age. Or at least the vast majority of us wrote about, you have to be this old to be able to vote. But even that raises a whole bunch of questions. Is a 16-year-old at Lake Oswego High School right now less qualified than a 50-year-old to make the kinds of decisions about who should be entrusted with making our laws? And I don't know if that's necessarily clear. We sort of think that young people don't have the mental fitness to do it, but couldn't we also make the argument that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of 50-year-olds that we might argue might not have the mental fitness to make those kinds of decisions? And so I really am asking you guys to think outside the box about voting in a democratic society. A lot of you guys wrote about education. That's a very complicated thing, isn't it? I think about someone, I try and test the boundaries of that, and I think about someone like Harriet Tubman, let's say, for example, who had no formal education at all, yet is someone that we're considering putting on the $20 bill and just had a feature film made about her. Would we really say because Harriet Tubman didn't go to high school or college that she shouldn't be a voter, that we shouldn't give her the power to vote in a republic, to choose those people that should be entrusted with the power to make laws or enforce laws or interpret laws? So education is really tricky. I made a comment to a couple of people, like if a college education is going to be a criteria, think about how many people we've just excluded in our democratic republic from making any kind of decisions about who should lead our government. So that's an interesting thing for us to think about. Another thing that people thought about, was mental fitness or incarceration. And if you've made a bad decision in your life and you were punished under the law for that and you serve some time in jail, well, now no longer, you've just forfeited your right to vote. And that's a very interesting thing to say, in my opinion, because that means that we have then made a decision that that person is going to be taken completely out of the democratic process for the remainder of their life, maybe because of a single mistake that they made when they were 18 years old, 19 years old, and that as a 50-year-old, they're still going to be a disenfranchised or marginalized person in terms of making decisions. And is that reasonable? And some of you guys question that. Mental fitness is also extraordinarily complicated. What does that mean? If I have a diagnosis, for example, of generalized anxiety, which according to the American Psychology or American Association of Psychologists or whatever, would be construed as a mental illness, and I have received a psychiatric what's the word I'm struggling for here? A psychiatric diagnosis of anxiety. Does that mean that I don't have the mental fitness to choose who's going to be our leader? And then are we going to start to delineate, well, if you have schizophrenia or if you have been diagnosed with sociopathy or a psychotic disorder, an antisocial disorder, that means that you can't vote. Is that really necessary? Is that important? And it seemed important to you, but I'm just wondering if that is important. And maybe we should just excuse that, because really all those people are doing is making a decision about who will lead our country, not actual decisions about whether or not a person will live or die. And it's a thought. The other interesting question was a question about citizenship. If you're born here or if you've received citizenship. And I remember, I think it was Ella talked about, her family lived in the Netherlands for a little while, and how much her parents were pleased that just as residents in that country, they had a capacity to make decisions or to vote on decisions. And whether or not even citizenship should be a requirement for voting, I think is a really interesting question. What was also really interesting is to take a look down here about the things that were off the table for you guys. One was, that clearly we're not going to discriminate based upon sex. That men and women both should be given the right to vote was just a given. Like, nobody talked about that. And yet, as we know in our country's history, that was a long struggle to incorporate women just because of their sex into the voting population of the United States. And it didn't happen until 1920, as I'll show you guys on the next slide. 1920, and our Constitution was ratified in 1787. So that it's a given now is nice, but in the history of the United States, that's not been an easy question. The other thing that was off the table is race. Nobody said, well, you have to be white to vote, right? Because that seems overtly racist. And it is. But also, we have to understand that has been a long and complicated story. And that's actually going to be the next chapter that we're going to take a look at with this assignment that I'm giving you tomorrow on Thursday. And then the other thing was wealth, that we thought, you don't have to earn a certain amount of money or own a certain amount of property in order to vote. Yet that also has been a long, storied history in our country. And when we think about you have to have a college education to vote, well, that's tied to wealth, but in an indirect way, right? So if we're saying, a qualification for voting is that you have to have a high school diploma, even then, we're realizing that class and education, those things are messy and they're intersected with each other. How do I sum this all up? What I'm trying to convince you guys is voting is such a fundamental right. The founding fathers didn't even think to list it in the Constitution as a right. It's so incredibly important that everyone is given the maximum amount of freedom to vote in a democratic society. That creates a healthy democratic society. That's the argument that I'm trying to make. And I think history has demonstrated, as we've moved forward historically, that seems to be the trajectory that the nation wants to go. We want to enfranchise, that's the word for gather together as many people as we can to vote, in order for voting to be effective, in order for a democracy to be healthy. And yet there's always a pushback, right? And you guys demonstrated that pushback here. There's also this reluctance that, yes, we do want to have as many people included in this decision-making process, But it's messy and it's uncomfortable when we start to think about that. The next thing I want to show you guys is this next slide, and then we're going to stop. Remember, I told you I had a timer here. I'm down to 4 minutes, and I don't want to keep up any more of your time. But when it comes to the Constitution and it comes to law, there's a long, long history here. Let me see if I can move this down a little bit. There we go. In the original Constitution, the Founding Fathers didn't talk about voting at all. The original articles of the Constitution, there's nothing about like all people shall be given the right to vote, or it was just an assumption. There's stuff about elections. So when we come up here to number 1, Article 1, Section 4, Paragraph 1, left elections entirely up to states, except for the president and the Electoral College. But even then, states chose electors, not voters. But what Article 1, Section 4, Paragraph 1 says is that the time, place, and rules of elections were originally up to the states when it came to senators and representatives, and then every single state office, of course. It was just left as an assumption. States will get to choose how they want to run their elections. It wasn't until 1869 that after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, that the 15th Amendment was passed to the Constitution, which made it clear no denial of voting based on race. But again, we have to remember that was only for men. Women were not yet allowed to vote in most states. In some states already, women were starting to get enfranchised and had been for a long time. But nationally, that wasn't the law. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment was passed that senators to Congress actually would be voted by popular election. It used to be that state legislators would choose their senators. And so even that, like we think about, oh yeah, we've always been electing these guys. That's not the case. The ones in bold here are the ones I really want us to focus on because they relate so much to our Padlet discussion. That brings us to the 19th Amendment. It wasn't until 1920 that it said that the Constitution of the United States prohibited denying women the right to vote across the country. So now women across the country and all races of people across the United States theoretically would be able to vote. But it wasn't until 1964 and 1965 that this really got addressed. Remember, literacy tests began, and we'll take a look at some documents about that, and poll taxes. In other words, you had to pay to vote in certain states. That wasn't outlawed until 1964. And even after 1964, some states, including the state of Virginia, as you see right here, still continued the practice of having people, when they voted, come and have to pay a fee to vote. Poor people, people of color, poor people of color in particular, that was a way to keep them out of the voting process all the way up until 1966. During this entire time, we also have to understand that the age range for who could vote varied from state to state. And it was because of the Vietnam War that Amendment 26 was passed that gave people over the age of 18 the right to vote across the country. So again, the point that I'm trying to make is there's lots of history here when it comes to voting, and it's not as clean and it's not as simple as we think. And qualifications for who gets to vote are very, very, very controversial. All right, this next assignment is going to take us back to the Reconstruction, and we can remind ourselves some of the things that Southern states were doing in order to keep people from voting. And this is hopefully going to be the next interesting assignment that you guys get to do. A little bit of review, same documents you already have looked at, and you're going to do a little bit of writing for me about that. And I really look forward to what you're doing. Thank you so much for all of your participation in that assignment. I was really excited to see so many voices coming out of the woodwork and your really good thought to that question. So we'll move forward now in history, and we'll take a look at this first question of how were people denied the right to vote based on race, even after they were freed as slaves? All right. Talk to you soon. Looking forward to your responses. Adios. By the way, this is what I call a hat haircut.